Distinguished representatives of the parties to the WHO, FCTC and the protocol, dear representatives of the IGOs and NGOs, dear experts and participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Tibor Szilagyi, and I'm the coordinator for the Knowledge Management, Reporting and Communications team at the Convention Secretariat, and I will be moderating the session today. Our webinar is entitled Organized Crime Groups and Illicit Tobacco Trade, Scale and Impact on Security and Public Finances. Before we start with the formal part of the meeting, let me summarize some key aspects of the conduct of this virtual meeting. Interpretation is provided in Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. On the bottom of the screen, please click on Interpretation, then select your language and mute the original language. Please use the Q&A function to ask a question. You can send them while speakers will be presenting, and as much time will allow us, they will be responded during the Q&A session after the presentations. Please use the chat function to seek support should you encounter a problem, for example, interpretation problems, sounds, and so on. As you may know, the Convention Secretariat has launched a series of technical webinars in response to the growing demand from the WHO, FCTC and protocol parties to better understand the challenges posed by illicit tobacco trade and to build capacity in implementing the provisions of the protocol. The first two webinars discussed the topics of free zones and licensing. Today, we will focus on the links between organized crime activities and illicit tobacco trade, while also discussing the measures available to parties to combat illicit trade. We hope that by the end of the session, you will become familiar with the latest trends in organized crime globally and on the importance for parties to implement measures under the protocol to combat organized crime and illicit tobacco trade. Before we start, we would like to inform the audience that the Convention Secretariat has received information that third-party actors are promoting their activities and disseminating information on behalf of the Convention Secretariat. In response, we would like to take this opportunity to reiterate that the Convention Secretariat does not engage with, endorse, or represent any third party with commercial and/or other vested interests in the tobacco industry, or any commercial actor whose main part of this is related to the protocol. We are now going to move to the next part of this webinar. We are glad to announce that we have a fortunate addition to our confirmed list of speakers. Mr. Piotr Strysowski, PhD, from the Directorate for Public Governance of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has kindly agreed to open the discussion for today's webinar and provide an overview of the main characteristics of the global market for illicit goods. Piotr Strysowski is senior economist at the OECD in charge of the task force on countering illicit trade. As the manager of the task force, Piotr supervises factual research on the magnitude and scope of illicit trade and on governance solutions to counter this threat. To advance the task force goals, Piotr works together with delegates from OECD member countries, industry, academia, and other international organizations. With more than 15 years at OECD, Piotr also has profound experience in several economic policy areas other than illicit trade, such as innovation, intellectual property rights, and the internet economy. The title of Piotr's presentation is Global Illicit Trade, a Well-Organized Business. Piotr, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tibor. Thank you for having me today. I will now share my screen with the presentation. Yes, my name is Piotr Strysowski, and at the OECD, I indeed manage the Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, which is the official OECD body designed and mandated by our member countries to counter illicit trade. But before countering illicit trade, before providing guidance on how to deal with this threat, what is necessary is to provide evidence to deepen the knowledge of illicit trade. And this is our actually main focus of activity. Provide better understanding of illicit trade, some data, facts about the scourge. So what is illicit trade actually? What are we focusing on? Well, it is hard to provide a really robust definition of a set of illicit trade. Under the umbrella of illicit trade, there are many phenomena that are often overlapping with each other. At our meetings, we talk about illicit trade in counterfeit goods, illicit tobacco trade, trade in substandard goods, fake alcohol, trade in cultural heritage. You can see many, I would say, sets under this common illicit trade umbrella. And again, many of these sets are overlapping. It's hard really to provide precise borders. For example, illicit tobacco can also infringe intellectual property rights of tobacco companies. It can be counterfeit. Illicit alcohol, the same, can be also counterfeit and can be substandard, right? So this is just to say that the boundaries are not specific, but what these goods have in common, they're all illicit. They all infringe legislation. They are all against the law. But at the same time, these are not criminal goods, right? Counterfeit goods are not the same in terms of legislation as narcotics or guns. These goods are in some legislation legal. The same for excise goods. They are not same, I mean, they do not constitute any criminal offense. They usually constitute civil offense. So illicit trade is, I would say, a shadow economy that is hard to define, yet it's a subject of interest of lots of criminals these days in the world. Because our data, our fact-finding exercises lead to a conclusion that today illicit trade is in fact booming. It's booming. And there are three reasons for it. The first is it's easy. It's relatively easy to get engaged in illicit trade. Over the past years, of course, we've seen booming trade in general, right? So there is lots of traded goods going from one country to another. Trade maps looks like a very complex thing. So at the same time, there is lots of logistical advancements. Think of free trade zones. Think of containerized maritime transport that facilitate the process of trade a lot. And what facilitates legal trade can be also misused by criminals, right? So with so many great advancements in legal trade, it becomes easier and easier to pollute these trade routes with illicit products. Think of e-commerce, right? Before the pandemics, it was already popular. Now it becomes a necessity. And what we see is that this necessity, this fantastic solution, becomes easily polluted by counterfeiters and other criminals operating illicit trade networks. So the first thing, getting into illicit trade is relatively easy with so much complex trade going on. But at the second time, it's, I would say, reliable business. Because unlike criminal offenses, unlike guns, or unlike heavy narcotics, many illicit products are not on top of priorities of enforcement agencies. So the risk of detection of enforcement authorities is not as high, right? It's, I would say, a relatively safe business to smuggle counterfeits or to smuggle tobacco compared to narcotics. And the last element, it's not only easy and reliable, but in case of failure, the costs are relatively low. Well, the classical example is, again, narcotics, right? In many countries, smuggling narcotics is subject to capital penalties. But when it comes to many sectors of illicit trade, it's not even recognized in many jurisdictions as a criminal offense, even if the scale is commercial. So today, illicit trade is not only booming, but this is because of some factors that make it very attractive. It's easy, it's reliable. In case of failure, the costs are low. And altogether makes illicit trade very attractive for organized criminal networks, for organized crime. And in the rest of my presentation, I would like to focus on 3 areas of evidence that we collected that support the finding that illicit trade is largely driven by organized crime. It's a well-organized business. These 3 areas are: 1, the scale, the largely commercial scale of illicit trade. The second one is modus operandi employed by smugglers. And the third one are examples, anecdotes that support this claim. Coming to the first one, the scale of illicit trade. As I said at the introduction, my work at the OECD is largely focused on providing evidence on illicit trade, on providing some facts on this risk. Unlike my colleagues who work for directorates for labor or employment or trade, I don't have this luxury to have access to national accounts, to official statistics on illicit trade. Because criminals, well, they don't obviously provide an official data. We need to rely on partial information that we get from enforcement authorities, from police, from industry. And altogether, these data give us some, I would say, signals that altogether provide some estimates of illicit trade. And these estimates point at the fact that this is a huge scale that cannot be achieved with some, I would say, unstructured networks. There must be organized crime behind it to arrive at such scale of operations. Only illicit trade in counterfeit goods amounts to about $500 billion a year. $500 billion per year. This order of magnitude is an order of magnitude of GDPs of some countries. This is not order of magnitude of, well, jackpots you can get playing Euro Millions or any other lottery. This is GDPs of countries. It's humongous scale. In order to arrive at this number, you must have access to great networks. You must run well-organized, globalized business. You must be an organized crime. Other estimates say that about 10% of traded tobacco is illicit. Again, such number cannot be attained only by individuals that go across borders. This is a huge number. If you look at the range of sectors that are polluted with illicit trade, with substandard goods, illicit goods, you can also find that this range is huge, but at the same time, you can see that the sectors that are intensely targeted are those where the profits are the highest. To monitor this trend, you must have some capacities of monitoring that are, again, clear indication that illicit trade is behind it. Think of another example about the scale. Think of wildlife trade, right? Wildlife trade is estimated to attain about $20 billion annually. But what is really fascinating here is that usually the supply and demand are really far away from each other globally. You must be a real, I would say, businessman, right? With no ethics, but businessman to match supply and demand really far away from each other and yet to attain such volume of illicit trade. So here, the takeaway from this slide is that all available signals about the scale of illicit trade support the claim that it must be a large scale organized networks behind it. And please keep in mind that we operate with partial data. What we really see here is the tip of the iceberg. The second set of evidence that really turns our attention to organized crime is modus operandi of networks of illicit trade. These are not local businesses. These people can effectively misuse many modern logistical solutions that are really good for trade in general. Think of modern containerized maritime transport. Many people do not realize how advanced modern containerized maritime transport is. Perhaps the recent blockage of Suez Canal turned some attention onto this threat. But in fact, over the past 30 years, there was a, I would say, revolution, technological revolution in container ships that enabled large globalized trade with such, I would say, advanced thing as a big ship carrying about 20,000 containers from one port to another. Many of these containers are polluted with illicit goods, ranging from tobacco to counterfeits and illicit pharmaceuticals. And you cannot be a single player, a single criminal doing this. You must have access to a wide range of instruments. It must be an organized crime to do it. Think of free trade zones that were already discussed at yet another WHO webinar. There are, in many cases, some free trade zones are often abused by criminals who know how to benefit from great solutions that these zones offer for bad purpose. And again, I'm not saying that all these things are bad, that containers are bad, that free trade zones are bad, that e-commerce is bad. I'm just saying that organized crime knows how to abuse these very good solutions in their businesses. And the second point of modus operandi actually is related to the first one. It's the global networks of operation. In many cases, I would say in most cases, networks of illicit trade are not local. It's rarely country-to-country operation. It's in most cases global operation with many intermediate actors on the way, with one single goal in mind, to maximize profits, These networks, that's point 3, share information very efficiently and effectively, locating enforcement gaps, locating weak spots in destination countries, how to enter them, how to turn customs life into hell by providing falsified information, falsified papers, how to respond to changing enforcement efforts. Altogether, very effective global and advanced modus operandi of drivers of illicit trade really shows that these are organized criminals behind it. And the third area of evidence that really points very strongly at presence of organized crime are examples. Actually, it's more than anecdotal evidence. It's like large set of examples that shows that it's organized crime in there. The first one is very similar patterns of illicit trade in numerous sectors. When we analyze illicit trade in counterfeits or tobacco or pharmaceuticals, we realize that there's lots of similarities, as if smugglers of these goods were basically drivers of huge trucks, and they don't care what they carry as long as they earn enough profits, right? So we can think here in this case of illicit trade as being, I would say, global logistical business that does not care about the nature of objects traded as long as the profits are high and the risks are low. And as I said today, for illicit trade in such goods as counterfeit or tobacco, profits are very high and risks are low. The second examples are results of many joint enforcement actions. And our colleagues at Europol or WCO provide us with lots of relevant examples here. Think of Operation Opson or Pangea. I will pass this because there's lots of available evidence that points at organized crime driving illicit trade in many sectors.
Excuse me, Piotr, 2 minutes,
Yes.
please. Thank
Good.
you.
One more example is evidence that many economies involved in illicit trade are those economies with presence of, well, organized or even terrorist networks. When we look at illicit trade coming from several Asian countries, we see those countries being also subject to, well, very active presence of, well, I would say terrorist networks there. And the last one is, of course, anecdotal evidence provided to us by customs or police authorities who say that, well, it's clearly organized crime running this. It's impossible that, that this is yet another mom and dad store. No, it's criminals from organized networks running illicit trade. Here, a good example, well, I'm Polish and reading the news recently, I saw that Polish border force has seized lots of illicit cigarettes. It's the biggest seizure in the past 30 years that is worth around $10 million. A single seizure, $10 million worth. No single smuggler can generate seizure. It is clearly organized crime. Let me just say that all this evidence that I presented can be found on our data set. We have lots of reports. Illicit trade is hard to study. Data are hard to find. So each of these reports provide additional spark of evidence. If you want to look for it, you can look at our webpage, oe.cd/TFCIT, or just email me. My name is not the easiest, but you can just Google Piotr OECD. You can find my email address. And I'll stop now. Again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Piotr, for this excellent summary for this presentation, setting the scene, in fact, for our discussions. So let's move to the next speaker. This is Simon Haysom from the Global Initiative to Combat Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC, an international NGO headquartered in Geneva, who will provide us with an overview of the linkages between organized crime and illicit tobacco trade. Simon is a senior analyst with the UNTOC, with experience in urban development, corruption, and organized crime, and over a decade of experience conducting qualitative fieldwork in challenging environments. Simon has been closely involved with UNTOC's pioneering work on heroin markets in Southern and East Africa, including leading multi-country studies on the development of illicit urban markets across the region. Simon's presentation is entitled Organized Crime Trends and the Illicit Tobacco Trade. Simon, you have the floor. 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Thibaut, and thank you to the WHO also for organizing this panel. I think it's a very important project around increasing adherence to the protocol. And thank you also to Piotr for the previous presentation, which I thought was a really brilliant overview to the issue of illicit trade. You can move to the next slide. I am from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. For those of you who are not familiar with the organization, we are an NGO with offices in Geneva, an office in Vienna, an office in Cape Town, and a presence in various other parts of the world. The organization was set up in 2013 to promote a more effective and coherent response to the issue of organized crime and illicit trade, which the people involved thought had become extremely corrosive to global development, democracy, and other ambitions of the international system. The Secretariat exists to provide evidence for those strategies and to create and promote new and innovative strategies to organize crime. And it's under that mandate that we have looked at the issue of the illicit tobacco trade. Next slide, please. I myself have looked at the issue of illicit tobacco in Southern Africa, particularly looking at the very acute situation in South Africa and cross-border smuggling between Zimbabwe and South Africa. I'm speaking based on that experience and also drawing on the insights of my colleagues who have looked at the issue in other parts of the world. I wanted to begin by, first of all, making some remarks about some of the difficulties around developing evidence and understanding the real situation regarding organized crime involvement in the illicit tobacco trade. Some of these issues are specific to tobacco or very pronounced when studying tobacco, and some of them are really issues that come up in many different crime types. Probably quite specific to the tobacco trade, there's really a strong sort of distorting factor that's introduced by very vocal and persuasive corporate lobbies. We find this in various parts of the world, and it has a big influence on media reporting on the issue, which can also skew sort of desk monitoring that's done. Big tobacco companies are often very proactive at producing their own research, which they disseminate to the media. It often gets picked up because it contains very catchy statistics and figures, which make for very good copy. We also encounter the limited efficacy of common measures for estimating illicit market size. Now, academics have done really brilliant work devising different ways of estimating, as Piotr said, markets that are essentially hidden and in the shadows. But often the media reporting and governments are using much simpler measures for trying to estimate the size of illicit markets. For example, only measuring products which are sold below the value of the excise tax as being part of the illicit market, thereby potentially excluding products which have been smuggled, counterfeited, or otherwise illicitly brought into the market, but which are selling above that value. Within the sort of common discussions around the illicit tobacco trade, there's quite a lot of focus on terrorist financing and conflict areas. We think that those are very important issues, and that understanding illicit trade in conflict zones is incredibly important because they can feed into war economies. But as previously mentioned, also the bulk of illicit trade in tobacco happens through licit infrastructure, and often very closely maps the routes of illicit trade. So through sensationalization, there can at times be a distorted characterization of this as being an issue of only the weakest states or most poorly governed areas, and that's not the case. As with many other crime types, lastly, and cutting across all of these, we have the problem of the visibility of enforcement and the invisibility of impunity, which is to say that illicit trade often becomes visible at the point where there's a seizure, arrest, or prosecution, and those happen where there is state enforcement. The state might be particularly enforcing laws around illicit tobacco because the problem is the worst there, but equally due to corruption or other factors, there can be places where there's very little enforcement and action, and so the problem remains relatively hidden. To get around this, we always advocate taking as broad a view as possible of illicit markets, drawing data from various sources, not using industry-funded data, and also not relying exclusively on law enforcement data. And you can pass the next slide. As part of this, we operate on increasingly through regional civil society observatories for studying illicit economies, trying to draw information as directly as possible from people who are involved either as participants, consumers, or in enforcement roles, or in civil society roles responding to the impacts of illicit trade. For this presentation, I've drawn on some observatory work that has been direct and is empirical, but also some sort of desk monitoring that has been done to provide a snapshot from just a few places. Next slide. WHO had asked me to speak about the types of organized crime actors involved. It's a very good question. It's quite a hard one to answer when it comes to a market, an industry which is as vast and as various and as global as illicit tobacco, and which manifests in different ways. Cross-border smuggling, counterfeiting, under-declaration. We would particularly highlight the role of corporate or white-collar criminals as playing a very important role in illicit trade networks, particularly because so many of these illicit flows rely on collusion between companies and syndicates and the political class. There can also be at a low level collusion by workers in production facilities, syndicates who are involved, purely on a trade or commercial basis, moving goods across borders, which from their perspective may or may not be illegal. It often doesn't matter. armed groups whose primary role is to generate funds for them to sort of wage the conflict, but who are often deeply involved in cross-border smuggling economies. Criminal gangs who we find are often involved particularly in distribution to retail markets, and state officials. These crimes require corruption, and that can happen at various levels. We think it's very important to make those kind of fine-grained distinctions about whether illicit trade is able to flourish because of small bribes paid to very low-level officials, or if it requires sort of higher-level collusion. And lastly, just to say that these organized crime networks could be coordinating global shipments. We see this in particular with products that are made in Asia, showing up illegally in far-flung parts of the world. But there are very, very strong and interconnected regional flows of illicit tobacco products. And that's something that's important to bear in mind. Next slide. I'm presenting a few snapshots of how this problem manifests in Central America, though it's perhaps the smallest Latin American market. We see a prominent role of free trade zones, particularly free trade zones in Panama, which are used. We see global supply chains of products that have moved from Asia, and we also see local consumption. Next slide. For Southeast and East Asia, again, we see major trade being widely used by traffickers. There have been several huge and repeated seizures of goods that had moved through free trade zones, that had been smuggled out of bonded warehouses, that had moved through ports in the region. And the use of that sort of highly sensitive national infrastructure does often imply the collusion of state officials. We see all types of smuggling present in the region, cross-border smuggling, illicit manufacturing, and counterfeiting of tobacco goods, and perhaps to a more pronounced level than in many other parts of the world, the use of both land and sea routes within the regional smuggling economy. The map on this slide highlights the countries where we find the most media reporting of the illicit trade in cigarettes and tobacco, often prompted by, in the case of Myanmar, concerns around its role in the war economy. In the case of China and Malaysia, a large amount of state enforcement, seizures, or repeated arrests around the economy. Referring back to my original points, though, we can't assume that the highest levels of media reporting necessarily correlate to the most severe illicit market problems. Next slide, please. In North Africa and the Sahel, we see regional trafficking corridors that are being used, ready to move the product from an entirely separate region to another. Much of the contraband tobacco in North Africa and the Sahel comes ultimately from the UAE, where it is manufactured, and it is often en route to Europe, particularly to France. However, as in all regions, there is also substantial local consumption. Perhaps 25% of all cigarettes in Tunisia are contraband, and perhaps 20% of cigarettes smoked in the Maghreb. The trade here is also substantially driven by price differences between countries and in the region, porous borders, and the ease of entry into the trade. Next slide, please. There is pronounced problems with the illicit market in sub-Saharan Africa. Here, research repeatedly highlights the role of tobacco companies, both multinational tobacco companies and also independent or national tobacco companies, which play a role in structuring the conditions for smuggling. This is usually arises sometimes indirectly as a result of influence that is applied to governments to keep tax rates low or to limit oversight or monitoring of production and supply chains for various reasons. This was very pronounced in the South African case at a particular point in the development of the illicit market. South Africa has a very large illicit market, which is largely domestically produced and is made possible by under-declaration of production, ghost exports, and other maneuvers. There's also cross-border smuggling in several locations across the continent. There's cross-border smuggling between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And that, quite interestingly, happens at two different levels. So you have both large trucks carrying large shipments that are allowed to pass over the border through corrupt relationships between traffickers and officials, as well as much more small-scale I wouldn't say disorganized, because there's still quite a level of organization, but really happening at much smaller volumes and with much lower level engagement with the state, where cases of cigarettes are smuggled over sort of unmanned or poorly observed parts of the border at night and transported in small vehicles. The Uganda-DRC border is another border where we see a lot of cross-border smuggling of great concern, because it reportedly funds activities of armed groups in the region. The Tanzania-Kenya border is another place where we see cross-border smuggling, but this time the collusion is believed to be between criminal syndicates and convenience store owners. In Malawi, there is a very low tobacco price. It's a large tobacco producer, and that is highlighted as a very key risk for smuggling. It's something, tobacco smuggling to neighboring countries. It hasn't been documented recently, but it has certainly been documented in the past. Next slide. Drawing on these various different snapshots and the in-depth research we've done in some places, we highlight 6 what I would call risk factors for organized crime involvement and illicit flows to develop. One is where tobacco companies have a large amount of sway over government policy, as previously mentioned. This is because that often results in low tax rates, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also weakened mechanisms for oversight over the industry. We also, across various commodities, notice particular weakness around grey products. So these products which are often legal at one point of sale or legal at one point in the supply chain and illegal at another, which is that they have a different and in certain ways more pronounced risk of corruption than other purely illegal and taboo products. And that is in part because syndicates often have legitimate companies, a legitimate face to what they do, which creates a much more open route for campaign donations or support to particular figures who can...
Simone, sorry, your time is over. Please try to conclude. Thank you.
Sure. I'm almost at the end. Weak revenue services, customs or financial intelligence investigative powers, these need to be strong in order to detect and to investigate the type of networks that are investigated in this commodity. We also see a risk where there is a large differential in tax regimes between adjacent countries. Often the corporate line on this is that the problem is high taxes. We would say the problem is the difference between the tax rates and the difference between the price of the commodities. Cigarettes are also increasingly seen as being used as a money laundering commodity. And lastly, cross-border smuggling, where cigarettes can fuel war economies, deserve an appropriate amount of attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for these great examples of various forms of illicit trade. Thank you. I would like to ask the audience to use the questions and answers Q&A function on the bottom of the screen to send your questions to both Piotr and Simone. Please, you can already send your questions. You don't need to wait until the end of our presentations. You can already pose your questions in the Q&A function. Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Theodore Liggett from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, who will provide us with an overview of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Ted has been a crime researcher for 26 years, including 16 with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. His work has focused on the relationship between crime, conflict, and development, and has been expressed particularly through a series of transnational organized crime threat assessments conducted in regions around the world. Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just waiting for my presentation to come up here. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to speak today on the TOC Convention and its relationship to the protocol. I should preface this by saying I am not, although I am, to my shame, a lawyer. I am not an expert on the TOC Convention. I am a crime researcher, but I'm hoping that my layperson's understanding of the convention will allow me to make it intelligible to you here today. I'd also like to thank the previous two speakers for establishing that tobacco trafficking is organized crime in the colloquial sense of the word. And now what I'm going to discuss is whether or not it is in fact organized crime and the international law sense of the word. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Organized Crime Convention is actually called the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. It entered into force rather recently, actually, or at least for people like me, in the 29th of September, 2003. It has 190 parties, which is pretty much universal acceptance. If you look at other international conventions, that's quite a good subscription level. And the purpose of the convention is to promote cooperation to prevent and combat transnational organized crime effectively. That's in Article 1. Next slide, please. Okay, so when a member state signs on to become to the Organized Crime Convention, a party to the Organized Crime Convention, there are certain requirements. First of all, the countries obligate themselves to criminalize particular conduct in their national laws. There are 4 crimes in particular that they have to incorporate into their national legislation. One is participation in an organized criminal group, which includes what is known in common law countries as conspiracy. One is laundering the proceeds of crime, so money laundering. There is a requirement to criminalize corruption related to organized crime and obstruction of justice. These 4 specialized crime areas that are mentioned in the convention become important later, so I'll bring them up again. Also, when a country signs on as a party to the convention, they're required to establish particular legal measures to the best of their abilities, including the liability of legal persons, which includes corporate liability, confiscation of proceeds of crime, and making use of special investigative techniques. I'll go into these a little bit more later. And then also the provisions that are intended to promote international cooperation, which is really kind of the engine of the TOC Convention. Countries agree to try to cooperate through extradition, mutual legal assistance, joint investigations, and by other means that I'll discuss a little bit later. And in other words, being a member of the Organized Crime Convention allows member states to take advantage of international networks to fight their local organized crime problems with cooperation from other countries. Next slide, please. All right, so now the Organized Crime Convention under Article 3.1 applies only to serious crime and the offenses, the 4 that I mentioned before, established in accordance with the convention, where there is an organized criminal group involved and the offense is transnational in nature. And I'll give you the definitions for both of those categories next. Next slide, please. Okay, the Organized Crime Convention doesn't actually go so far as to define organized crime. There wasn't an easy way of coming up with an agreement on that topic. So rather than doing that, an organized criminal group is defined. And this becomes important in understanding the application of the law. So an organized criminal group is defined very broadly within the convention. This is intentionally so because they didn't want to enumerate a bunch of different crime areas, understanding that organized crime is dynamic and constantly evolving and constantly changing. So the first part of the definition is that it involves a structured group of 3 or more persons existing for a period of time, which is a pretty low threshold to cross. Most any kind of crime involves 3 or more persons existing for a period of time, particularly if it's aimed at criminal profits. They're acting in concert, also sort of self-evident, with the aim of committing 1 or more serious crimes, which I'll define in a second, or those 4 offenses established in accordance with the convention. And this is very important. The purpose of that crime has to be in order to create financial or other material benefit, either directly or indirectly. In other words, it basically has to be profit-motivated crime. And that's really the distinguishing characteristic of organized crime, in addition to the seriousness of the crimes being executed. Next slide, please. Okay, so now under the convention, the definition of serious crime, and this becomes important, is an offense that is punishable by a maximum deprivation of liberty of at least 4 years or more serious penalty. So this is a problem I think that Piot pointed out in his first presentation. I'm afraid that the offenses we're dealing with here are not always, at least I think it would be very rare, that we would find them associated with 4 years or more in prison. More likely they're civil infractions. Next slide, please. Transnational is very broad. Virtually any sense of the word that you can talk about something being transnational is covered under the convention. So if it's committed in more than 1 state, if it's committed in 1 state but has a substantial preparation, planning, direction, or control taking place in another state, if it's committed in 1 state but involves an organized criminal group that engages in criminal activities in more than 1 state, or it's committed in 1 state but has its substantial effects in another state. And with most of these offenses, since they involve transnational commerce, oftentimes this condition is almost always satisfied. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Organized Crime Convention, as I said before, involves some legal measures. Article 10 talks about the liability of legal persons, which includes businesses and corporations. They can also be subject to criminal penalties if the member state is compliant with the convention. Confiscation must be allowed for, including the possibility of international confiscation. And this is important for countries which are seeking to do any reparations for damages done by organized crime groups operating out of other states. Special investigative techniques, these involve things like controlled deliveries or wiretapping or other sorts of ways of doing the investigations associated with organized crime. Witness protection programs should be established. The language at the bottom says either the party shall adopt or they shall take appropriate measures for the protection of witnesses, for example. This is an important area for investigation of organized crime. Assistance to and protection of victims, including compensation, and measures to enhance cooperation with law enforcement authorities, as we've delineated before. Next slide. And these include, oops, gone too far, one back. Yeah. These are the sorts of things we're talking about there. Mutual legal assistance, extradition, very importantly. Of course, these, as you can see from the language below, not all of these are obligatory on the parties. They should consider, and all of them are subject to the agreements or the laws being consistent with the national legal systems. As you may be aware, many countries have conditions that do not allow them to extradite, or they're subject to bilateral extradition treaties, which have their own provisions. But one of the purposes of the Organized Crime Convention is to allow for the possibility of extradition. Law enforcement cooperation, so joint operations and things of this sort, joint investigations. international cooperation for the purposes of confiscation, very important to be able to get at assets which have been situated outside the jurisdiction of the country which is receiving the damage. In this case, it would be the country which is suffering the losses of tax revenues or the health impacts of tobacco smuggling. A transfer of criminal proceedings from one jurisdiction to another, very useful for getting at international criminals that may be difficult to access in their home countries, and transfer of sentenced persons for the purposes of serving out their term of incarceration. Next slide, please. So the bottom line question we hope to answer here today is, could cigarette smuggling be combated utilizing UNTOC, the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention? And the answer is yes, if the relevant offense is punishable by 4 or more years in prison. Now, we know that's quite a high barrier for a lot of countries. But I think if prosecutors are able to look broadly, and perhaps looking indeed at some of the 4 crimes in UNTOC, including the conspiracy provision, they might be able to successfully situate tobacco trafficking in the UNTOC context. The problem is that the conspiracy provision itself does involve seriousness. So there are basically 2 conditions under which these 4 crimes can be used, or the conspiracy crime can be used specifically. One is if the conspiracy involves a serious crime, which goes back to the 4 or more years, or that the group involves that conspiracy involves an organized criminal group, which, as we know, one of the defining characteristics of an organized criminal group is that it's engaged in serious crime. However, there is a possibility, if we're talking about a classic organized crime group that's engaged in a variety of criminal activities like a Sicilian mafia or something of that sort, then tobacco trafficking in conjunction with that group would still fall under the convention, just even though if tobacco trafficking itself does not attract the 4-year penalty necessarily. So there are ways of situating a prosecution that allows availing oneself of the UNTOC provisions, even if national legislation doesn't carry fines of or penalties of over a year in prison for tobacco trafficking. However, I think to be on the safe side, and I think this is something we've certainly promoted, I've recently been working for the last several years on wildlife crime. And if one of the campaigns we've engaged in as an organization is an attempt to get the world to take this crime seriously, because as with tobacco trafficking, it has been neglected. There are many jurisdictions where violation of the international rules for the trade in endangered species are not regarded as criminal offenses at all. They cannot attract criminal penalties. They are indeed civil infractions only. But we were able to get a number of countries around the world to relook at their legislation and upgrade the offense commensurate with the damage associated with a crime. So a number of countries have recently redone their wildlife trafficking legislation and increased the penalties to satisfy the convention threshold. And it is indeed possible that we could do something very similar with tobacco trafficking, to get countries to recognize the serious impact on public health that this offense carries and to punish it proportionately. If we are able to accomplish this, obviously this would allow enhanced extradition. So countries which are suffering, and I can tell you from my own research in this area, there's many cases where there's bilateral relations where one country is clearly supplying the illicit tobacco markets of another country, and there's currently very little that can be done about that by the country which is on the receiving end of this trade. But under UNTOC, there would be possibilities would open up for sure. One of them being the possibility of extradition of offenders, and joint investigations and mutual legal between the 2 countries, and I think particularly relevant cooperation for confiscation, including legal persons, which means that corporate assets, if there's a large company involved in fueling the illegal trade, those assets could be seized, and this money could be used for compensation of the aggrieved party in this case. I think that's all I wanted to say today. I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope I've set the stage for the next speaker to go further into this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for your presentation on the UNTOC Convention. And indeed, To the audience, please put your questions in the questions and answers window at the bottom of the page. And let's go for the next presentation, which is the last one at the same time. I would like to call on my colleague from the Convention Secretariat, Mrs. Joni Decker, who will present on how parties can benefit from the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products in the fight against organized crime. Joni is a technical officer with the development assistance team of the Convention Secretariat. Joni, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tibor, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I feel very privileged to be the last speaker in this line, because I'm hoping to really wrap up the discussions on this and to promote, let's say, our own instrument in the fight against organized crime, the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products. And I'm hoping to do so with a few examples that really shows how this instrument can benefit parties, not only in their fight against illicit tobacco trade, but also in their fight against the criminal actors involved in this illicit tobacco trade. So just as a very quick recap on why there is a need for this protocol, we've heard already this already from other speakers. But the illicit trade in tobacco funds other types of transnational organized criminal activity, such as terrorism, arms smuggling, armed robberies. These are a few headlines in that regard. But also it costs governments a lot of money because they miss the revenue that comes from the illicit products. Obviously, on illicit products, there's no excise taxes being paid that don't go into the central budgets of government. And finally, also very important for us here in Geneva is the effects it can have on public health, as already been mentioned also by previous speakers. Illicit tobacco products are more affordable, targeted towards more vulnerable populations, but also don't have the checks on the contents of the products, making them more dangerous often for people who use tobacco. So how can this protocol help parties in targeting the illicit trade, but also mainly the actors behind it? And the first one is really on the supply chain of tobacco products. The protocol offers a whole chapter on that helps and enables parties to better distinguish between the licit and illicit products and licit and illicit actors. So also this is important for them to be able to enforce their laws more effectively, but also to avoid any necessary interaction with the tobacco industry, for example, so they can really uphold their obligations under Article 5.3 of the WHO FCTC. And just to give you an example on how this could really benefit parties and the easier distinguishment between licit and illicit actors, is, for example, in Article 6 on the licensing of the actors in the supply chain of tobacco products. Article 6 requires all the parties to license manufacturers, but also importers of tobacco products in their territory, making it easier to, instead of having to do long investigations in evidence collection, to have to invest lots of money in surveillance, for example, and costs of evidence gathering. Suspicious locations or suspicious actor can, by, I state it very simply now, by a very simple knock on the door and asking for the right paperwork, already have the first step into determining whether or not there's illicit or illicit activity taking place. So that makes life for government authorities in the first step of investigations much easier in that difference between licit and illicit. And then also to add to what Ted just presented on offences and the criminalization of offences, it's good to state that the UNTOC is very explicitly named in several places in this protocol, most notably in Article 2.4, where it's really stated that it's mutual reinforcing. But also what's special about the protocol as opposed to the UNTOC is that there's a very low threshold for offenses. So there's a whole list of activities where parties are obligated to establish them at least as unlawful conduct. And of course, as previous speakers have stated, this is a very low threshold. This is often, this is not a criminal offense directly per se. This is often administrative or civil. But also Article 14, where all these obligations are laid down in the protocol, also ask parties to consider which one of these conducts they consider to be a criminal offense. So it really, by implementing the protocol, parties have to rethink their sanctions regime on the offenses related to illicit trade in tobacco. And as previous speakers have stated, the higher the sanctions for these offenses, the more possibilities parties have for international cooperation, but also the deterrent function of sanctions towards criminal offenses. There's, unlike the UNTOC, there's no link to a specific penalty, there's no 4-year obligation, and there's also no link to a specific type of actor in this sense. It does recognize, just like UNTOC, that legal persons can also be criminal liable if parties choose to do so according to the national legislation. Seizures are possible, but very important, I think, here is also the possibility for disposal and destruction of manufacturing equipment, raw tobacco and tobacco products, and especially the manufacturing equipment to avoid this manufacturing equipment going back into the illicit supply chain circle of tobacco products. Finally, in Article 19, there's the possibility for parties to engage in special investigative techniques to detect illicit trade, and it gives a whole range of examples stemming from electronic surveillance to undercover operations. So it really gives, the protocol gives parties a big toolbox to go after a large set of unlawful conduct, but also with a large toolbox of measures to be taken. Just to focus on one specific area of crime where a lot of international cooperation is always needed, but also gives parties an extra possibility, is the crime of money laundering. Sometimes or often it's impossible for governments to go after the actual activity or to prove the actual activity of the illicit trade in tobacco. But follow the money is a principle that is very popular at this moment, and that can also really help parties. And the protocol recognizes this as well. In Article 14 on the criminal offenses, it's been explicitly named, both as unlawful conduct or criminal offense, but also as one of the areas where explicit international cooperation is needed. And this has also been recognized by this illicit tobacco trade report conducted by the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international governmental organization dealing with money laundering and terrorist financing. In their 2012 report, if I summarize it very, very shortly, they state how important it is to really identify the sources of illicit financial flows that coming also from illicit trade in tobacco. And again, as stated before, the size of the sanctioning of these offenses to really criminalize offenses related to illicit tobacco trade, to further enhance the possibilities to go after them, to go after the illicit financial flows behind them and behind the organized crime groups that are behind them. What is the extra benefit of the protocol in that regard is that the protocol has very explicit Article 10, that deals with the prevention of money laundering, preventative measures. And so, for example, it encourages authorities to make sure that the licensed actors in the tobacco supply chain don't use cross-border transfer of cash, that suspicious transactions are being reported to the competent authorities in the government, that invoices are paid in the right currency and in the right amount, and only by legal means of payment and no alternative remittance system. So it really recognizes this risk of cigarette smuggling and illicit and money laundering. Then finally, just very shortly, the protocol really has a very big range, very big chapter on international cooperation. Basically, in the first part, having a lot of possibilities for parties to share information with each other, either general information surrounding illicit trade, but also explicit enforcement information sharing possibilities. There are numerous articles that make assistance and cooperation possibilities between parties explicit, this being on scientific evidence sharing, technical training, technical assistance, but also in the investigation and prosecution of offenses. And what's also good to mention here is that for the protocol, this is not only focused solely on international cooperation, but it really encourages parties also to cooperate within their own, between their authorities, their law enforcement authorities, and their customs authorities, because as we have seen in previous webinars that we have organized, customs is a very important part of the fight against illicit trade in tobacco products. And in this chapter of the protocol, customs authorities, law enforcement authorities, judiciary, they're all being called upon to fight illicit trade in tobacco products with each other, but also with their international counterparts. So again, this chapter gives a very big toolbox for different governmental authorities to really go after these organized crime groups that are engaging in illicit trade in tobacco products. So in conclusion, we can say that the protocol has a very comprehensive framework that allows for a very strict supply chain control, making it very easy for parties to distinguish between licit and illicit products, but also licit and illicit actors, which is important when going after organized crime groups. Also that the protocol can be used to go after these crime groups with a lower threshold than maybe other international legal instruments. And that can help as being a starting point or a stepping stone into international investigations in these organized crime groups. And that can also be done together with other parties or with other partners within your government, because it allows for a very broad toolbox for cooperation. Thank you very much, and I'll take any question that you may have.
Thank you, Yoni, for this overview. And indeed, questions have reached us, and I see that the presenters proactively, they have already responded to some of the questions in the Q&A box, so that's very good. We collected a few questions, one to each speaker, and I would like now to pose these questions. The question one goes to Piotr. Piotr, how important you think is the unusual trade route as a risk management indicator for illicit trade in tobacco? Piotr, could you address this question, please?
Yes, so just to reiterate, how important is unusual trade route in?
How important is the unusual trade route as a risk management indicator for illicit trade for tobacco?
Well, if I get the scope of the question correctly, it is about scoping anomalies in illicit trade. This is, to my knowledge, one of the primary factors for determining the likelihood of a given trade route being abused by smugglers. This is not only specific to tobacco, also to other goods, such as pharmaceuticals of alcohol, right? Comparison between standard trade patterns and looking for anomalies, either with respect to given size of shipment or with respect to given actor who is there, or also with respect to given product that is there. In fact, smugglers who are behind the trade routes try to abuse some non-standard trade routes just to go under the radar screen of enforcement authorities in destination countries. So here I would underscore that it's extremely important to look for such anomalies, given that inspection of all the shipments, given the growing trade routes, is impossible. So such anomalies are not to be underestimated in importance for efficient risk profiling.
Thank you, Piotr, for your response. The second question goes to Simon. Simon, how can parties to the protocol access information on illicit trade in tobacco products that is not funded by the industry? So where are these sources of information that are not industry funded?
Thank you, Piotr. That's a very good question. I think that people really have to look for sources of information which are proactively declaring that they don't take tobacco funding. Our own organization has very recently made that a public declaration. There are academic units at various universities across the world which very openly declare that that's a principle of their funding and their research. And further than that, I think that it's either going to be found in people whose mandate is specifically around illicit economies or around public health impact of these types of commodity flows. The Global Initiative produces for some of the regions regular observatories of illicit trade, and I know that our Southern Eastern European Observatory and our Southern African Observatory fairly regularly have bulletins that concern tobacco products and tobacco flows.
Thank you, Simon, for that response. And the third question goes to Ted. Ted, how parties to the protocol can access technical support offered by UNODC?
Yes, thanks. Well, there are many different mechanisms by which this could be availed. I think one that's particularly relevant based on what's just been said is our container control program, which provides training to customs officials in exactly the kind of profiling that was being described before, how to look at the paperwork and the documentation and identify containers which are worthy of search. And it's been an incredibly successful program globally in enhancing what customs officers do. I mean, for me, it kind of just reinvents the job for customs officials. I think sometimes customs officials feel like their job is to process trade as quickly as possible and stamp as many forms. If you can talk to them and turn them into law enforcement officers to make them reimagine their job and see how they can protect their country from dangerous commodities coming in like illicit tobacco, it not only energizes them as individuals, but it greatly enhances their productivity. And we try to provide them with the tools to be able to do that. So if you want to contact UNODC, we can put you in contact with the right people that can allow you to participate in this program if you're not already. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted, for that. And let's remind ourselves that in Piotr's presentation we have already seen so many resources that are available from UNODC and from other sources. So in that presentation you have also seen lots of resources that could be referred to. And let me go to the next question that goes to Yoni. Yoni, what do you think are the barriers to stronger international cooperation in the fight against illicit trade in tobacco products?
Yes, thank you, Tibor. I think there's three aspects that really determine barriers to international cooperation. I think the first and foremost is, I think, something that all speakers today addressed is the sanctions or the limited sanctions that are currently into place on illicit trade in tobacco products. And for international cooperation under international criminal instruments, you really need to have activities seen as offenses. So it's really important that parties reconsider their look at their national laws when implementing this protocol and really look at the level of sanctioning for these different type of activities that are named in this protocol, but also in the UNTOC, for example. Of course, which is always tricky with the international cooperation in these type of matters is that it's always according to national laws, and parties always have the right to protect, of course, their own jurisdiction and their sovereignty. So there really needs to be an international willingness to cooperate with each other. And this is also dialogues like these, webinars like these really are essential to increase knowledge of the topic, but also to increase the urgency that is felt by parties to really cooperate in these matters with each other. And lastly, and finally, with a lot of the international cooperation in terms of assistance and technical assistance that are named in the protocol, it's of course the availability of funds, but also the availability of resources, that there's enough manpower also in law enforcement agencies present that can facilitate international cooperation between different agencies and different, also internally between different authorities within parties, but also with their counterparts in other parties.
Thank you, Yoni, for that response. I have another question coming in to Ted. Ted, if we have to start more research on tobacco smuggling, what are the key areas we do have to focus on? So what are the key areas for new research related to tobacco smuggling?
Well, I'll tell you what we'd like to do. I'd like to do something similar to what has been done with wildlife crime and establish a global seizure database. Right now, such a thing doesn't exist, but every time customs or other agencies encounter contraband tobacco, I'd like to have the details of that captured in a single global database. And this will allow us to track the trends over time in terms of, we'll find routes, we'll find which countries are the worst affected based on enforcement. As Simone said, obviously enforcement data is affected by corruption and other capacity weaknesses. So countries which don't have a lot of capacity to interdict these things are not necessarily not affected. However, seizure data is very useful because even if the poorer or countries with lower capacity are not able to intercept illegal trade, other countries do that for them. So countries of origin, countries of transit oftentimes can seize illicit tobacco, which is on its way to developing countries or other countries where seizures might not be made. So every time we make a seizure, we know where that container was coming from and where it was going to. And this allows us to track, even for areas where there's not a lot of information on the illicit traffic, exactly where this traffic is taking place. We'd love to do a global study on illicit tobacco trafficking, as we have done for wildlife and trafficking in persons and the other areas that we work on. We're just looking for resources on that. And if there's anyone, a party here that would like to support us in that work, we'd be very happy to speak to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. And I see the hand of Piotr. Piotr, you have the floor.
Yes, I just wanted to add to the question that was answered by Yoni on international barriers in effective countering illicit trade in tobacco. As Yoni mentioned, this is a global threat, but at the same time, the scope of competences in areas that could address this threat is really peppered throughout many institutions. Illicit trade in, well, maritime transport, that's something within the IMO. There's WTO, there is WHO like you. So this is just to say that competences are really dispersed among many institutions, and this actually highlights the importance and relevance of such initiative as you're currently leading, as I would say, holistic initiative to address this problem that otherwise would have been peppered throughout so many different bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr, for that addition. I have a question to Simone. Simone, do we have information about the situation in Europe? Because you have highlighted examples from different parts of the world, but what is the situation in Europe? Could you just highlight some features around here?
Yes, thanks for that question. We actually have an observatory in southern eastern Europe, which does monitor, amongst other flows, tobacco flows. And I would really refer people to the CE OBS materials. They have maps of various routes and some analysis of the overlap with other commodities or lack of overlap with other commodities, as the case may be. But it's certainly a very prominent commodity in that region.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Let me just add to that the Secretariat also has knowledge hubs who are helping parties to the FCTC, and they can do the same with the protocol that collect information and disseminate information in relation to various aspects of the implementation of the FCTC. And one of them that is based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa deals with tobacco taxation and also with illicit trade in tobacco products. They have recently put together an e-library for resources related to tobacco taxation and illicit trade. So I would welcome participants to visit the e-library of our Knowledge Hub on taxation and look at the resources out there for to control illicit trade in tobacco products. So let me see if my colleagues could send me any other questions related to or to speakers. No, it was the last question. I really encourage my colleagues, because I saw that there are some questions related to the proceedings of the meeting, whether the presentations will be available. Those could be answered in the chat box as well. So we have now reached the end of this session, but before we close, let me summarize briefly what we learned today. We have heard about the magnitude of illicit trade markets worldwide and the specificities of illicit trade in tobacco products, including the risk factors that contribute to the high profit and the low risk environment surrounding this illicit activity. We were provided points to the role and modus operandi of organized crime networks involved, while examples of regional trends and shipment routes have also been described. In addition, we have been provided with an understanding on how UNTOC, the main instrument dedicated to combating transnational organized crime, works, and how the protocol can complement it in the particular context of illicit tobacco trade, including in the areas of supply chain control, money laundering, and international cooperation. We hope that these presentations contributed to raising the awareness and understanding of the challenge posed by illicit tobacco and some of the tools available to member states to combat the organized crime actors involved. And I have already spoken about the knowledge hubs, especially the knowledge hub on tobacco taxation and illicit trade, which has some additional resources in relation to illicit trade in tobacco products. And one thing we should not forget, it's not just the illicit tobacco products that are more dangerous, but they couldn't be more dangerous because licit tobacco products are dangerous themselves. So there are serious health impacts related to licit tobacco products as well, not only to illicit tobacco products, which are as dangerous as illicit ones. So thank you very much to you all for joining us in this webinar. We have had very interesting presentations followed by a productive discussion. Special thanks go to the speakers for their presentations, but also to participants for taking the time to join us in this session. For some of you, it is very early, and for others, very late. We appreciate your presence here. I would like to thank interpreters for their invaluable work and IT colleagues for their great support. Finally, I would like to thank my colleagues in the Convention Secretariat who helped prepare and manage this webinar. In the coming days, we will be communicating about the details of the upcoming webinar via our website, social media, and email. Please stay tuned. We have already conducted 2 before. That was the 3rd one, and the 4th one is coming. We are planning to have 1 every month. And we would also like to remind you that the recordings of this webinar in 6 languages will be available on the YouTube channel of the Convention Secretariat. So you will be able to listen to it again and to share with your colleagues who are not able at this time to join this webinar. And for now, this is all from us. I wish you very well and keep healthy and safe. The meeting is closed. Goodbye.